So, good morning, everyone. My name is Dennis Sonoia. I'm an engineer by profession, currently with the Communications Authority of Kenya, the administration for Kenya. I have been presented with an interesting topic for our discussion this morning, and I am sincerely hoping that you will participate and be challenged, because my presentation may be slightly unconventional, because my objective is to challenge our thinking, challenge our conception, our ideas, and what will drive us over the next 4 years as a continent. Before I get into the topic of the day, which is the adoption of emerging technologies, like emerging radio communication technologies, I wish to draw our attention to this image. This image was developed with data from the ITU, maybe 2 years old, but I was especially attracted to it because of 2 or 3 interesting issues that I wish to discuss before I go to our main topic for the day. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but this one in particular is worth 1 billion words. Simply because we may be aware that Africa's population is around 1.3 billion, and from the ITU data, 75% or 74.9% have no access to the internet. What does that mean? It means that almost 1 billion Africans have no access to the internet. 2 things. Manufacturers of equipment. Asia and North America, in particular, are key drivers of this. And I recently had a discussion with my friend from South Korea. He told me that one of their main challenges as a country is building entry loss. From an engineering perspective, that is, building entry loss, BEL. Those who follow study group 3 of the ITU will know that this has been an agenda item and things that there's some considerable work on this. But for Africa, is building entry loss our serious problem? Our serious problem is rural access to the internet. Ultimately, we lead them to be at the forefront of policy decision making. At every forum where you sit, when you discuss serious policy, be it at the WRC or other forums of intellectual property development, including IEEE, you will find that countries that conduct research will ultimately end up with the loudest voice at the table because they are presenting data and facts. I wish to challenge us to contribute to this in the coming days and be able to position Africa at a better advantage. Okay. Here, we'll just take some 2 keynotes that only South Africa and Nigeria have internet access greater than 50%. For the rest of us, that means we need to consider our current approach. Is it working for us? Will it serve us for the next 5 years? By 2030, will the entire African continent be connected to the internet? Current trends and policy direction may not be very optimistic. But I wish to challenge you with a list of emerging radio communications technologies. We are all aware of dynamic spectrum access technology. Good applications have been developed in the 802.11 family of standards. A lot of unlicensed band equipment use this technology, but we wish to consider other applications outside the unlicensed bands, either in the UHF spectrum, either in bands projected for 5G, in 3.5, and so on. Cognitive radio technology works hand in hand with dynamic spectrum access. Cognitive radio technology was adapted from software-defined radio. I remember doing some considerable work on this in my undergraduate studies 8 years ago on software-defined radio, and I'm pleased to see that it has evolved to a position of great advantage in cognitive radio technology. We'll discuss that briefly later. Geolocation database technology is one of many other solutions, including spectrum sensing, that are a key component of the 3-pronged ecosystem for dynamic spectrum access management, which is dynamic spectrum access, cognitive radio, and geolocation database. This would allow real-time location of active transmitters in any for the primary user in any band. So coupled with spectrum sensing, you'd be able to detect, it's like listen before transmit kind of approach. The last two are more of unlicensed applications that are of great importance: ultra-wideband technology and LoRa, long-range radio technology, or LP1, low-power wide area networks. So before I discuss a bit more on these technologies, I wish to run through a case study of Kenya. Like, what is Kenya doing? This is a spectrum management system for Kenya. Key emphasis is on ITU, international coordination, and notification processes. We had to make sure that is the backbone of any system that we adopt. So when we have a national registry, we're able to manage all licenses for spectrum-related services, integration with the financial, accounting, and billing processes, and the process of assignment is much more streamlined, and we have online application for all licenses. This is an initiative that we took 4 years ago, and it was actually implemented by the end of 2015, start of 2016. And there are some significant advantages I'll wish to discuss on the next slide. According to the annual report for our Communication Authority of Kenya, there has been significant reduction of harmful RF interference between licensed operators. Note that I've said licensed and not the unauthorized ones, like repeaters and boosters that are coming up all over Africa, simply because of adoption of this system. We have witnessed efficient planning, licensing, and coordination of RF spectrum. It has provided us with a platform for analysis of our spectrum usage trends, identifying idle bands, and be able to project for future needs. We have surprisingly and quite commendably experienced an increase in revenue from spectrum licenses, and I wish to indicate that this was an increase of $20 million per annum, like experience from the previous year, 2015, to the year 2016. Government of Kenya garnered $20 million more than in the previous year. What does it say about African countries that are yet to adopt automation software for spectrum management, including SMS4DC, which is why we are here? These solutions will be able to position the regulator and the government at large to harness the real and full potential of spectrum licensing. And I think it's a great motivation, and perhaps may challenge more of our countries and participants, especially our honorable delegates, to send this message back home. Further to this system has provided a basis for participation in regional and international research. Again, I don't mean international meetings, international research. Often in the past, we would walk to Geneva, sit in the meeting room, follow discussions and serious deliberations without bringing data from Kenya. Over the past 2 years, we've been able to analyze and disseminate and prepare reports on actual spectrum usage needs, and this has placed us at a great advantage as we participate in ATU meetings with KESIAS and prepare our positions as the African continent for the upcoming WRC and for future research. Again, I revert to the technologies that we mentioned earlier. And you'll notice that the main application for the dynamic spectrum access, cognitive radio, and the geolocation database is for the UHF band TV white spaces program. In Kenya, we are currently running a series of trials in partnership with the academic institutions and industry giants to find and develop a framework that is suitable for our country. The regulatory perspective on this, and I would wish to challenge all Africans to think about this, is licensed shared access. The operators or the technology manufacturers we wish to challenge and call for unlicensed access to UHF band, which has been causing nervous anxiety amongst many administrations of Africa, because you will undoubtedly face great challenges from the broadcasters who will dispute this notion. So to prevent any problems, we are still working on policy direction that will enable us to make a key decision on these issues. The last two technologies are indicated: urban and short-range broadband, and IoT and machine-to-machine communication. This will be an ISM and licensed in our projection. So what is Kenya's strategy for adopting emerging radio technologies? Look at the first one. We adopted automated spectrum management solution. This was great. It was It was a moment of hurrah for the whole country. We were so happy. Increase in revenue by 40% or 35% of revenue, which was great for the government. The central bank is happy. But are the consumers happy? An increase in 30% revenue does not imply that all rural people have access to the internet. If anything, the rate of rural penetration in Kenya has slowed down since the adoption of this system, which means operators about rural access. It costs around 100 million Kenya shillings, or how much is that in dollars? $1 million to deploy a single rural base station. Because of challenges of rural access, solar power, standby generators, all that, the capex is quite high. OPEX in some areas of our country is affected by insecurity, especially towards our border with Somalia. We've had recent attacks by militias simply out to damage in communications infrastructure and put themselves on the map and say, hey, we control this area. So the first solution was not enough to improve our situation on the map. And I'll rush you swiftly back to the first chart of the African continent. Secondly, we decided to initiate professional partnerships with research institutions. Research institutions may include universities, especially public or private universities in our countries, to harness and take advantage of the know-how and the staff and skills and professional expertise that they have to be able to develop solutions for our country. We have also decided to build adequate capacity on RF spectrum technology and policy research. This has been achieved with a little or with great contribution, especially from the ATU, Mr. Kezias and Abdul Karim Sumaila, and from the ITU, specifically in my case, Mr. Jean-Jacques Massima, who has been of great importance and assistance to, I think, the entire continent. He may be representative for the Central Africa, but he acts like he's helping all Africans. He does not discriminate. And he always tells me, don't tell us about our problems. Tell us about solutions. What solutions are you going to bring for the African continent? I joined the Communication Authority of Kenya 6 years ago, and I met him a few months later, and I've been challenged specifically, and I wish to applaud him for that. So currently where we are at Kenya, we are stage 4. We are issuing trial authorizations for scientific research. This will be done in partnership with the research institutions and universities. And we already have developed MOUs with the university to run research, incorporate our engineers at the authority, and participate in this world-leading research. We're also conducting actual measurements and perform analysis of this data. We acquired a spectrum monitoring solution from Rodan Schwartz, one of our associates for the ITU. The equipment is good. It is also interfaced with many other solutions. In fact, even with SMS4DC, we have the inbox-outbox method. We are currently participating keenly in regional and international RF spectrum research meetings. There's also an IEEE meeting on radio communication coming up in Mauritius in the next 2 months. Maybe we'll also be keen to attend. To also, now that most of us are engineers from our countries and policymakers, it is important for us to participate in research that will change Africa. It's not enough to follow proceedings and say, okay, we didn't object. Present data. Change our conception about technology. I remember our honorable delegate from Uganda yesterday mentioned something about political solutions. If we look at this map, I do not see any political solution that will change the colors on this map. This is going to be purely a technological and ideological change in how we as spectrum managers and engineers think about the future of our continent. If it was a political solution, it would only affect 5% of the countries. Now we are looking at 45 or so countries in red, another 7 in yellow. The greatest challenge to implementation of any new emerging technology and any change in how we view spectrum and how the government views spectrum revenue, especially across sub-Saharan Africa, is policy. Most of our spectrum policies are outdated. Kenya's spectrum policy was almost 10 years old. The process of changing it is currently underway. But however, this has been ongoing review process for the last 4 or 5 years. Changes happen, it is put on hold. The next one, develop guidelines and regulations to allow policy implementation. So once the policy is in place, how do you now convince the lawmakers, politicians, to allow policy implementation? This, again, the challenge lies on us, and it is by incorporating them in all our activities. So briefly on dynamic spectrum access research. This is to investigate dynamic spectrum access and geolocation database technology combined with software-defined radio implementations, that is like cognitive radio, and to establish how it can be used to enable effective and efficient wireless networks to be built at scale, especially for rural applications, to support affordable internet. A typical setup for TVWS technology will look like this. And I'll draw you to the link between the backhaul and the customer premise equipment. We have scenarios where it can be deployed as point to multi-point or point to area connection, serving at least 5, 6 customer premises. Challenges that we envision as a country: inadequate spectrum management and monitoring systems. In as far as we have possibly the best or good equipment across Africa, or like for Kenya in particular, we have good equipment from these companies that I mentioned before. They are not designed for the future of communications. Many of them are designed for the now state, where we are. 5 years from now, who knows? Limited human and technical capability for RF spectrum research. We may be engineers, we are trained, we've gone to school, we have 5 years experience, or 10 or 20 or 30. However, when it comes to RF spectrum research, it is different from ordinary research. In this field, only those with data can speak. You cannot speak at a conference without data. The first phase would be to automate your systems, conduct measurements, and thereafter present publications and reports so that people can take your position. Otherwise, you cannot say, I object, simply because, as the delegate from Uganda would say, a political reason. We also have outdated national policies, I had mentioned in the previous slide, and rigid regulations. And how we are challenging them is look at this. So the acquisition of a spectrum management software, including SMS4DC, in-depth training of engineers. SMS4DC would also apply, especially for those who are starting out or who don't have a system. It is a must-have sort of software. As you wait, because of there's no complex procurement regulations since you are a member of the ITU. This is quite straightforward. I know the process of acquiring any other solutions would take more than 2 years or so. Quite complicated. In-depth training of engineers on evidence-based research, a key factor that we need to consider as Africans. How much? They say in South Korea or Japan, anybody can code. From 10 years, 12 years, 13 years old, anyone can write software programs. Be creative. How are we doing as Africans in mainstreaming such ideas in our curriculum? You know, we have innovation hubs and all that, but this must be core in our curriculum. Thinking big. Must think like any other country. Establishment of partnerships with universities for research. Again, I'd mentioned this earlier. Participation of engineers in research and ITUR meetings, which will be, of course, of great value in capacity building and allow them to think big. And further, for the policy and regulation aspect, we need to involve all national stakeholders in policy making. For many countries, we have multiple regulators for broadcasting, telecommunication services, and the Ministry of Communication, which at times may be at loggerheads in agreeing on spectrum issues, especially on issues like UHF TVWS, where you have a separate entity in charge of broadcasting service, another one in charge of telecommunication. So where is the line? Where do we draw the line? Remember, the future is content. So how would we address this and position ourselves to be at a great advantage? I thank you all again for your kind attention, and I do hope I've challenged your thinking and visions about Africa in the next 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denis, for this overview of the trends. And of course, as we are mainly focusing on spectrum monitoring, it's very good for you to see what's the usage of his automated software applications. So on. So Kezias, please, can you deliver your presentation And after, you will take question and answer and have an open discussion. Thank you.
So thank you again to Mr. Massima. Thank you to Mr. Bozowski. Thank you to the D sector of the ITU for putting this together alongside the NCA and the government of Ghana. I'm hoping we can have my presentation online.
Okay, while waiting for techniques, I will take a few questions, if you want, for Denis after this presentation. The time for Kezias to check if, of course, the presentation has been uploaded there in this computer. So I open the floor. If you have some comments on the technological trends, automated systems. There's one question here. Yes, Isvan?
Yes, finally. So thank you very much for your presentation because it was really very interesting. I just have one remark because you mentioned that you want to participate in ITUR meetings, which I completely support. But I wish to call your attention and to everybody is that in the ITUD we have also study groups, which the work of the study groups was finalized during the WTDC, so we have the new study questions. And there are a lot of things where your contributions would be very much appreciated. Because we have study questions like the broadband issue, we have a large one, so I'm sure that a lot of things what you mentioned here, it would be useful to present. We have broadcasting questions. Yesterday we saw the laboratory and we have questions on the EMF, for example, which can be interested. And the main idea of these study groups is that to share experiences and to provide case studies for all the countries who are participating. Unfortunately, we don't have any more resolution 9, which is the spectrum. But if you have something related spectrum, we can put it in some of the questions. We have also conformance interoperability, which is also a question where you can contribute. So thank you.
Okay. So I have a question from Guinea, please. Guinea, you have the floor.
Merci de cette brillante présentation. Il a embrassé tous les problèmes et les contraintes auxquelles les gestionnaires du spectre font face, et sur l'avenir aussi. Juste ma première remarque ou contribution, c'est de dire qu'effectivement, en ce qui concerne l'Internet aujourd'hui, l'accès à Internet, on a des problèmes. C'est vrai, le coût est élevé, vu le revenu des consommateurs que représente la population. Mais cependant, nous, en tant que gestionnaires de spectre, on a des pistes que nous pourrons explorer pour rendre ce coût abordable. On a des fréquences avec licence, on a des fréquences qui sont sans licence. Je pense aujourd'hui que les fréquences sans licence peuvent jouer un grand rôle dans le cadre de l'accès universel pour connecter les zones rurales. Des fréquences dites non licences, la bande de 2.4 giga, la bande de 5.8 giga, c'est vrai, selon les réglementations de pays. Il y a des pays qui les font payer, selon leurs réglementations. Mais si on s'en tient, on se rattache au principe de l'UIT, les fréquences à licence aujourd'hui, je pense que le continent africain doit les exploiter dans le cadre de la connectivité des zones rurales. Ça, c'est un. Deux, En ce qui concerne la gestion efficace et efficiente du spectre, l'outil, par exemple, software que l'UIT a développé est d'une importance capitale. Mais cependant, les pratiques actuellement doivent répondre aux besoins que le besoin en spectre est aujourd'hui de plus en plus important. Car quand on pense à la connectivité des objets, Internet of Things, on pense aussi aux besoins qui étaient là et on pense au futur. Donc on aura l'impression, quelqu'un qui a une idée du spectre par rapport aux besoins, il va se dire non, le spectre ne peut plus suffire aux besoins auxquels on fait face. Mais cependant, il peut suffire. Il suffit de faire une utilisation efficiente. C'est-à-dire, au lieu d'utiliser et thésauriser le spectre, utiliser juste le spectre là où on a besoin. Et cela, il faut des outils et des contrôles. À ce sujet, je pense qu'aujourd'hui, il serait nécessaire que nous, les Africains, nous mutualisons nos ressources et que nous harmonisons nos façons de faire et de gérer le spectre. Ça peut faciliter à faire non seulement des économies à grande échelle. Par exemple, si on harmonise, on planifie les bandes avec les mêmes pas, on les harmonise, on les gère d'une façon efficiente, les opérateurs qui vont se déployer d'un pays à un autre, il ne va pas avoir des obstacles. À peu près, il se retrouvera toujours dans le même environnement et cela peut nous permettre de faire des économies d'échelle. Mais aussi, on a des barrières. Lors de ses présentations, il a parlé que l'ingénieur fait la gestion, le contrôle, mais il y a des barrières politiques aussi. Il faut se dire aujourd'hui, il faudra quand même sensibiliser les décideurs. Ceux qui décident, il faudra les sensibiliser. Pourquoi? Parce que normalement, le spectre peut s'autofinancer. Lorsqu'on vend les licences, cet argent peut servir, n'est-ce pas, s'il est recyclé dans la gestion et le contrôle du spectre, de se doter des outils et de former le personnel et d'équiper les universités. Mais cela ne peut pas se faire si on ne sensibilise pas les décideurs. Parce que le dernier mot leur revient. C'est à eux de décider qu'est-ce qu'on fait de l'argent. Nous, ce qu'on peut faire, c'est de faire des études, faire des simulations, leur montrer, voilà ce qui est faisable, voilà ce qui n'est faisable, voilà les avantages, voilà les inconvénients. Mais en ce qui concerne les décisions, les derniers mots les appartiennent toujours. Et pour finir, pour ne pas abuser, parce qu'il y a beaucoup qui veulent intervenir, je pense que il serait souhaitable que nous mettons sur place une plateforme de réflexion, comme il a dit, dans le cadre de la recherche, pour que tous ceux qui sont concernés ou qui ont des connaissances ou qui sont dans la gestion du spectre puissent échanger. Une sorte de forum où on peut échanger régulièrement sur des questions spécifiques. Et je vous remercie.
Bien, merci beaucoup. C'était plus des commentaires et des propositions que des questions à Denis. Donc nous prenons note de ces commentaires. Le Ghana avait demandé la parole. J'arrêterai là les... Et il y avait un autre... Voilà, là-bas. C'est toujours Ghana. Alors Ghana, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Raymond with the NCA of Ghana. We met the latter part of your presentation, and specifically on the slide on dynamic spectrum access. And you made mention of providing necessary conditions or enabling environment for the deployment of emerging technologies. And you mentioned geolocation database and TV white spaces. I want to find out the current status of these enabling environments in your home country as far as Kenya is concerned. What's the status of your country like?
Okay, thank you for your question. Another question from Ghana, and we'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm Jean Odi from Rwanda. My comment, or just my intervention, is almost similar to that one from Guinea. I think that we need to sensitize the internet service provider to think about rural areas, because they tend to deploy their activities or their operations in cities in big cities where they expect to get many customers. But we think that we need to sensitize ISPs to deploy the operation in rural areas, because the many challenges in rural areas, as you said in your presentation. I think that it is our task, and even our decision makers, not engineers, and also as regulators, and also decision makers, to sensitize those ISPs and the telecom operators also, to deploy also so many internet coverage or connectivity in rural areas. Another, it is like a small question. I want to know about the regulatory perspective concerning cognitive radios. How do you expect to solve that problem? Also, how do you plan in Kenya about those cognitive radios, regulatory perspective? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Denis. Some few answers from Denis on that specific point. Our delegate from Guinea was commenting, saying that, okay, we should use non-large science frequency spectrum available in order to tackle the issue of access in the rural areas. But this is what's the experience of Kenya. Please.
All right. Thank you, Guinea, for your remarks. So, unlicensed spectrum authorizations may not really solve the current problems that we have. Simply because, like, if we consider UHF band for propagation, we are able to have non-line of sight communication, which is something very unique, considering that most rural areas at least have either a hill, a forest, or some kind of an irregular terrain. So for that particular reason, we are really favoring adoption of this dynamic spectrum access in the UHF band. We had run this project 2-3 years ago, and it stalled because of policy. But now we believe we have the right political capital, as the delegate from Uganda would be very happy to hear, that we have strategized by involving all levels of government in this discussion. We have involved all members of our National Preparatory Committee for the WRCs, the various stakeholders, really to drive this agenda for us and consider participating in research. See, when you argue with numbers, people cannot dispute. So you just present data, and the logic will follow gradually. I'll dash to Rwanda. You asked on the policy on cognitive radio, and the regulatory perspective is the same idea that we're working on, that we want to create a multi-stakeholder convention kind of program where we will just drive home the particular details of these projects and the advantages. Of course, arguing from a position of knowledge. So it will be of great advantage, as always, to conclude our research in time. And with that, I skip to Ghana. We are at stage 4 in the chart. If I remember the programs, we had adoption of automated systems, conduct research, develop research partnerships. So we are now at the stage where we are conducting research on the field, in the ground, take measurements, prepare publications, be submitted at the next meetings. I think that covers most of the questions. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go straight to my presentation today. Are we able to? Okay, great. So I will treat for like 3 things. The first one is to define the usual terminologies that we find in my topic today, because my topic today is wireless telecommunications policy trends. So we'll try to define those terminologies in that topic, so we are on the same page. Then I'll go forth to state the 4 eras, all right, and their main policy focus, and then I will discuss the key elements for each era. So straight on, the topic says the wireless telecommunications policy trends, and therefore the first terminology we find there is wireless, and in my view, that speaks to almost entirely communication enabled by the radio spectrum. Of course, you'll find other wireless technologies, but I think for this purpose, we mean the radio spectrum. Now, regarding policy, policy is simply a deliberate system of principles to guide decisions and achieve rational outcomes. So when you hear someone say, our policy is this, my policy towards this is that, it's simply a deliberate system of principles, hopefully well thought, hopefully written somewhere, but not always. All right? And then what we note about policy is that, like I've said, is a statement of intent, okay, specifying either procedures or protocols on how to do something or how to achieve something, all right? And then what we also note about policies is that they are generally adopted by a governing body of a particular institution, or you as an individual, or as a family. All right? So in the case of governments, naturally, therefore, the policy of a government would be, I'd say, a ministry level, or at the highest level, which is the cabinet or the presidency. So like I've said, these assist in decision making, and they can be, one, subjective, meaning you cannot really quantify them. All right? You may have a case where someone says, my personal policy is not to drive fast, but fast to me is not fast to you. So that is sort of a subjective policy. But you may have an objective policy whereby you are able to measure. Okay? And then when it comes to trends, trends are nothing other than a general direction in which something is developing or changing. So a general direction in which something is changing or developing. And therefore, what we can note about trends is that, again, is somewhat subjective. It may depend from one person to the other, and it may depend on how someone looks at things. Let's take, for example, climate change. You have some of us who believe climate change is a hoax, and yet you have some amongst us who believe that climate change is real. So you have the danger that when you are discussing a trend, one person may say, well, I really don't agree with you. And if you're lucky, they may agree with you. So similarly, when I'm going to discuss the trends in telecommunication policy, if it's something that you do not agree with, this is okay. Because I looked at things from my perspective with my 15-year, 16-year experience in telecommunications, and also before, when I was a user of telecommunications. But my hope is that we should be able to agree in terms of at least the basic elements as to what these trends are. Now, to help us understand this from a basic and straightforward angle, I elected to define the trends going by the generations of the telecommunication systems that we have had so far. So the first circle there is, you see, which is the first era, and this one, I've termed this before the first generation. So before your AMPS, before your GSM, we had this era, which I called the first era. The second era is the first generation, which is AMPS. Okay? For those who may remember, AMPS was an analog cellular system. It was cellular, yes, but it was based on an analog system. And then that era, to me, also had the second generation, which was essentially the GSM. Now, you will note that I've square bracketed the first generation because in some countries, they did not really have the first generation, which was the ARM system. They simply went from 0 to the second generation, which was GSM. And then the third era to me is the data era, which was enabled by the 2.75 G. Some would say 2.5, but not quite, in my view. But then you have a full-blown data era, which is the 3G, and now the 4G. And then the fourth era, which we are beginning to enter into, in my view, is the 4.5G, all right, and the 5G. And of course, we may have a 6G in future. So to me, that's broadly how I've characterized the 4 eras to help us define this trend, this progression in terms of policy trends regarding wireless telecommunications. Now, this slide, ladies and gentlemen, is at the heart of my discussion this morning and for this workshop, because it is on this slide that I've put what I believe have been the trends, the wireless telecommunications trends over time. So the first era, the policy, I would say the policy for that was policy as in from the viewpoint of governments around the world, was mass communication mainly for government propaganda. And I'm going to justify why I believe this is the case in a moment. Then the second generation was communication freedom, access, and coverage. I'm going to say why I believe so. The third era is indeed broadband for development. So, as you can see, we are moving from mass communication mainly for government propaganda, nothing to do with development, nothing to do with communication freedom, nothing to do with universal access and coverage, but mainly for government propaganda. And then the second era, which was communication freedom, indeed giving people the freedom to communicate where and whenever they are, giving them access and focusing on the mass coverage. The third era, which we are living, now going into the fourth era, is indeed broadband for development. Now, something that is new, and I hope you can agree with me, is that the fourth era which we are entering, which is 4.5 and 5G, is indeed where governments are defining ICTs as a strategic area. So ICTs are no longer simply broadband for development, but they are much more, and they are now being defined as strategic areas by as many governments as I know. Now, if you see the colors of the circles are again very deliberate. You already had nothing in the first circle, which was the first era. You have the green for the second circle. You have the yellow for the third circle. But note here that I labeled the fourth era, which we are entering, as red. Now, in many instances, green is not a problem. Yellow, perhaps you should be paying attention. But red really you must pay attention because this is a matter of life and death. So the colors have a meaning. And of course, you see here that the circles are not standalone. Okay, they are somewhat overlapping. That again is deliberate to show that there's really no a cutoff date between the progression of these policies. Is one policy leading on to the other? There is an overlap. Are we okay? Is that clear? Thank you. So let's say this guy is not working. Okay. So let's look at the elements within those policy trends. We've seen that the first circle was mass communication for government propaganda. The second was freedom. The third was the B4D, broadband for development. And the last one was the ICTs being defined as a strategic area. So let's see what the elements within the first circle were, which was before your cellular communications. So here, if you study the books, the telecommunications history, I hope you can agree with me that here you had broadcasting, both TV and sound, as a key, well, you may say ICT technology. Of course, that time there were no ICTs, but now we know there's something called ICTs, and really broadcasting, both TV and radio, was the key technology that time. And how do we know? We know that because broadcasting got more than, I stress, more than 50% of the prime spectrum. And since we are spectrum guys here, we know that the prime spectrum is below 1 gig. And truly so, broadcasting, both radio and TV, had more than 50% of that prime spectrum. And it was befitting, because at that time, broadcasting was the mainstay in terms of the ICT technology. And then, when it came to telecommunications proper, you had the public switched telecommunications network, the PSTN, the landlines. Okay, this was the key telecommunications technology, focusing on government offices, to some extent also private companies, but there were really no much private companies, because by then economies were not liberalized. So everything was parastatal. Everything was government controlled and run. Of course, you had a few payphones here and there, a payphone at a school, if you are lucky, a payphone at a hospital, if you are lucky. One thing I stress here is that home communication, home connection was 100% luxury. You needed to be a minister to have a line in your home. It was that simple. You needed to be the head of perhaps the PSTN itself to have a line in your home. Okay. And then, like I've said, telecom was run by the states for two reasons, mainly for two reasons: to act as an employment vehicle. So that time, the PSTNs were not supposed to make money. No, they were not supposed to make money. They were supposed to employ as many people as possible, and they were supposed to run as a charity. Why do I say so? Because it was very common that since the PSTN was largely providing services to the government was not paying those bills. Government agencies get the monthly bills and not just pay them. And it was unthinkable for you as the head of a PSTN operator to go and switch off the Ministry of Health. It was unthinkable for you to go and switch off the Ministry of Education. They would ask you, what's WhatsApp, what's wrong with you? You are not supposed to take profit. Okay? And then fax, telefax, here I've written telegram, but I think I meant to say were the key services. And then Spectrum really was administered by the PSTN itself. So you had the telcos, the incumbent telcos, the monopoly, administering Spectrum, mainly for TV, two-way radios, shortwave, medium wave, and broadcasting. Now you see that later I'm going to change the terminology from Spectrum administered by someone, Spectrum managed by someone, because I believe that the two are different. Management focuses on prudency, focuses on efficiency, and so forth, while administration is, well, the way you can do it, okay, there's no problem in terms of efficiency. Okay? And here I note that there were no ICT ministries and no ICT regulators either, because it was meaningless. The PSTN was not supposed to make profit. It was supposed to employ as many people as possible and operate as a charity. Of course, there was no internet, and I'm hoping there was no Google and no WhatsApp either. All right? So let's see what's happening now. Let's progress. So a trend up to the first generation for those who are lucky to start with the first generation, the AMPs. But as many of the African countries would know, many of them went straight from 0 to the second generation. So here, the emphasis, okay? So we are moving from mass communication as a government propaganda machinery to really communication freedom, access, and coverage. Now, what do we know? How do we know that this is the case? Because now, communication places so much emphasis on freedom to communicate. Okay? So communication communication freedom came to mankind, but at a very, very high cost. Okay? Buying a handset was almost like buying a car, almost. All right? A handset would cost you as much as $2,000 or more. All right? And then, I don't know how many of us remember that if you bought airtime, say $10, you are given 3 days to use this $10. How many people remember that? Thank you. What's happened to the rest of you? You never experience that when you are given a time limit in which to use your money in the phone. Otherwise, the mobile operator would actually forfeit. Okay? So we had this era called use it or lose it. And truly, you had to find someone midnight to call in order to exhaust your airtime, because if you crossed midnight, your $7 remaining out of the $10 that you bought was going to be forfeited to the operator. So GSM replaced the AMPs very, very quickly because the AMPs technology was, frankly speaking, not viable. It had a lot of both technical limitations and therefore commercial limitations. This era saw the coming of short message service, and really it came with a bang because in some markets, SMS quickly replaced voice as the main revenue stream for the mobile operators. Okay? It really came with a bang, and sooner or later you had the multimedia service. Internet during this period was mainly wired LANs, all right? And then you could only access internet over your desktop. There were no smartphones and no iPads either. And then it was mainly delivered by copper lines. Now, this era, the first and second generation, that's when we see the beginning of spectrum management. So we are moving from spectrum administration, which was do it the way you want, to really do it with prudency, efficiency, and effectiveness in mind. And now we began to see the creation of ministries for ICTs as well as regulators for ICT. Now, it's natural that governments look for money wherever they can get it, okay? And frankly speaking, ICTs were seen as, sooner or later, very, very quickly, we are seen as a cash cow because licenses for your mobile operators shot up, spectrum fees shot up, ICTs became taxable, and so forth. So yes, governments saw that opportunity and saw the ICTs as cash cows. Liberalization, it was about the same time when the liberalization kicked in, not only in ICTs, because then you moved from your monopoly, okay, the PSN operator, to 2, 3 mobile telecommunications operators, as well as a few more ISPs. But that kind of liberalization did not only affect the ICT sector, it also went to other sectors, health, schools, and so forth. In this era, we see that the benefit, all right, of ICTs to socio-economic development, even when it was a narrow band, so your 2.5, your edge and the GPRS, you could see that indeed that contributed to your socio-economic development. So we see the progression, we see the beginning, even when it was at a small level, the beginning of broadband for development, but not quite. But you could see that indeed, perhaps if you went broadband, you can amplify this aspect of things. Here, I must admit that you had broadband, but that broadband was only on fixed platform and not your mobile platform. So let's go up, one level up, which is broadband for development. Remember that the 2.5 G at least created this appetite, created this feeling that indeed, if you give people broadband, you attain higher GDPs, higher socio-economic development. And indeed, with 3G, and more so with 4G, this is an era of not only fixed broadband, but now broadband on the go, broadband on the mobile. Okay? And then, when it came to your fixed broadband, this became a super broadband, super fast broadband, because then you were able to not only connect to via your copper line, but now you have fiber to home, fiber to the office, and so forth. Now, what we note in this era, the second bullet there, is that Wi-Fi becomes a staple. Okay? Wi-Fi becomes perhaps more than food, more than water in some cases. Because the moment you check in the hotel, what is the first question you ask? What is the password? Okay? I don't remember people asking, so do we have water here or not? Okay? Or where can I eat food? No, what is there? What is the password? So Wi-Fi becomes a staple in this era. Okay? And not only for hotels and so forth, but now even for airports, even in public institutions like hospitals, for example. Okay? And then the correlation between your broadband and development is now quantifiable. Remember that in the second generation, at the end of the second generation, the 2.5G, we had a doubt whether this internet contributes to socio-economic development. But in this era, we know for sure, and we're able to quantify. You know, the first study that came out, the very breakthrough study that came through was from the World Bank, where they assessed that 10% additional penetration in the broadband yields as much as 3% in terms of the gross domestic product. Okay? And then, since we are spectrum people here, what we also note is that we are progressing from spectrum being administered by some individual within the PSTN to a whole ministry looking at spectrum, to a whole regulator looking at spectrum. And now, in the third era, we are seeing even more spectrum identified for mobile communications. And why? Because we know this thing is far good to us than we thought. And therefore, to make sure that it's promoted, countries around the world identified much more additional spectrum for mobile. And something that I've deliberately put there is that to an extent of, for a lack of a better term, grabbing some of the spectrum from the TV. Remember that TV at its prime had more than 50% of the prime spectrum. And now, in this era, we are seeing that countries around the world, through the WRC, redeeming part of that spectrum for mobile. But it is not all rosy. It is not all rosy, because then controls kicked in. Okay? Controls kicked in terms of price, not explicit price control, but implicit price control, where governments started putting up caps on your roaming, on your interconnect. Okay? Okay? I think this is the case in many African countries, if not world over, where there's a cap between your interconnect, between your roaming calls. Then focus went to quality of service, because yes, broadband is now for development, and therefore you needed to control quality. Universal coverage was a focus, because countries knew that they have to give as much connection, as much access and coverage to these ICTs to the whole population as far as they can go. All right? And we see subsidies for rural networks, okay, which was unheard of. And then we see the coming of community networks. Broadband is deemed as essential, and therefore its infrastructure is also essential. And you know that the moment government defines something as essential infrastructure, it attracts money, okay? And frankly speaking, here, apart from countries developing broadband plans, you have almost all countries pumping in money to do fiber backbones. You know that, all right? Additional spectrum kicking for IMT, all right? But again, an antidote to that says that the spectrum became so valuable that some countries elected to license it via the auctions. With limited success, I must add, with limited success. In this era, we see the start of dynamic spectrum access. I think our brother Dennis explained that very well, that Kenya, amongst other countries, are thinking, testing, going towards a dynamic spectrum access. All they are doing now is to find that right balance. I can announce here that countries like South Africa, and I see the South African delegate there, that they published guidelines for TV white space. So in South Africa, it is very, very official. Malawi did that a long time ago, and I think Ghana also. I'm not so sure, but so we have many countries who are thinking about dynamic spectrum access. Why? Because spectrum is such a key issue towards enabling broadband for all and broadband for development. The last two things there that you see is, of course, the moment you make progress, the thieves, okay, the bad guys will also be making progress. Okay? So, as all this was happening, the bad guys, the cyber crime guys, the cyber criminals, made such a huge progress that they became a real threat. You know that banks are losing billions of dollars each year towards the crime. You know that individuals are losing a lot of money each year towards cyber crime. You know that essential infrastructure, military and all that, being hacked. Okay, election system are being hacked via cyber crime. And therefore, this became an issue. In this era, it became amplified in this era. And then we have seen remarkable developments in various ICT technologies. So satellite systems are way advanced. Hub systems are way advanced, even the TV itself, and so forth, even your devices. Okay, so quickly, the fourth era. Here we talk about the 4.5G as well as the 5G. Okay. The one thing we note here is that the ICTs become the backbones for social economic development. ICTs become more than broadband because now we talk about Internet of Things, machine to machine, record to something. All right. And then it is very clear that in many countries, the policy now is to define the ICTs as enabler for the fourth industrial revolution. Okay, and to do that, the countries are putting in real money, seed money to develop the ICTs. Cybersecurity has become such a key issue. In the case of Zimbabwe, for example, I really personally like what they've done because the ministry, the name of the ministry for ICTs is now ICTs and cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is not just sitting in some corner somewhere. It's really elevated, I guess, to the highest level you can. And you know that America defined the cybersecurity command at an equal status as the Navy and the other army units. So, ladies and gentlemen, I leave you with this summary, okay, whereby, in my view, the trend has been the first era, mass communication, mainly for government propaganda. The second era, communication freedom, access and coverage. The third era, broadband for development. And now we have ICTs as a strategic area. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kezias. Thank you, Kezias, ladies and gentlemen. I will open the floor for a range of 3 or 4 questions before the cafe break. And you can benefit during the cafe break for your social networking and having more details. But I am opening the floor for you if you want to make some comments or have some clarifications on Kezia's presentation. I know Kezias is always very clear and clear enough. Anyhow, all these presentations will be posted in ITU, Regional Office of Africa website. To access this website, you have to go to ITU website, development sector, because you have radio communication, standardization, and development sector, regional presence, and when you click Africa, we'll have all the reference to your website with the RDF and the workshop. So enjoy your coffee break. We will resume at 10:30. Please to follow up the day. Thank you.
There's a comment here.
One comment from Andrew. Andrew, Tanzania, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, I was thinking we should not break before I congratulate Mr. Kezias, because that was a wonderful analysis. I really loved it. So it's real having a certain message where we are coming from and where we are going. But the other thing which I would like to recommend to propose to our office, I think it's Cassius or the previous speaker who said that our ICT policy, spectrum policy are outdated. We really need to take a stock of that and see how we can harmonize and update this policy. Because we are the technorants who we advise our governments. And you know, all the legislation, regulations, the genesis is the policy. If we have outdated policy, we'll have outdated legislation, outdated regulation. So we need really to take a stock in Africa to know our policies, how much are outdated. Thank you.
I feel coming from Tanzania, of course, but also attending most of the PR study groups meetings in terms of coordination of frequencies, and of course, he is a resource person and an engineer of reference. So thanks for your comments. We'll have a 15 minutes coffee break because you are not so much like yesterday after the opening. And after we resume at 10:30, please. Thank you.